Chapter 4. Elsa leaned out the window to catch another glimpse of the three ships sailing toward her harbor. Anna, Kristoff, and Olaf were bunched up behind her, Anna with her hand on her shoulder, trying to lift herself high enough to see over her head. The ships were closing fast and sailing in single file. A line of war, Alec had called it. She was no naval expert, but she'd heard the term and understood its meaning. Ships in battle would often sail in single file line, ensuring that each ship wouldn't interfere with the attacks of the other. If that was their purpose, then she expected them to turn at any moment, bearing their broadsides to prepare for a volley of projectiles. But they didn't. They continued straight for the harbor as if they meant to dock. Even if that was their intention, it brought her no comfort. The vessels were close enough now she could see the banner which bore the insignia of the Southern Isles, waving and rippling on the lead ship's mast, and just above it a white flag tore at its flagpole, whipped into a frenzy by the fjord's heavy winds. There was no mistaking the signal. Whoever piloted the ships wanted her to believe they came in peace. Elsa knew she had few defenses if it was a trap, as most of the weapons in the armory were depleted long ago, traded in exchange for food, water, and other essentials. Arendel's need was great, and after emptying the treasuries they turned to selling the castle's furniture and furnishings. When those were gone, they were left with few choices, either acquire the goods they needed or perish. As a result, Elsa commanded their weapons of defense be sold. Her logic seemed sound at the time, that swords and spears were of little use in combating starvation and dehydration. There were some who opposed her decision, saying Arendelle would be left defenseless. However, she considered the threat of the drought to take precedence over the potential danger of some imagined force. The decision seemed obvious then, but now, as she watched the encroachment of the ships upon her harbor, she wondered if she'd made a mistake. The ship slowed as they neared the sea gate, and she saw the men upon the decks now, scurrying about as they pulled ropes and turned wheels, preparing to dock. They were dressed plainly, with white tops and dark trousers, and she squinted trying to tell if they wore the uniform of a soldier. She didn't think so, but at this distance she couldn't be sure. Alec waited on the dock with 6 guards, half his men prepared to receive the approaching ships. But what were half a dozen guards against so many? They were spread out along the edge of the harbor, a sparse line of men stretched from the town square to the end of the dock with Alec at its head. She wondered if they were as tense as she was. She knew they stood no chance against an assault if one came, and yet each one was ready to make a stand, to give their life to protect Arendelle if need be. She hoped it wouldn't come to that. The first ship passed through the gate, its momentum arrested as it navigated the harbor and drifted toward the shore. It dropped anchor and came to a stop at the docks, and for a while nothing happened. Then a man appeared at the bow, a sailor who was decidedly not dressed like a soldier, and he engaged in an exchange with Alec, but Elsa was unable to hear what was being said. She studied their body language, looking for a sign of confrontation, such as defensive postures or erratic gestures, but neither man made any threatening moves. "What are they saying?" Anna asked, pulling on Elsa's shoulder. "Shh!" Elsa hissed. While the man was negotiating with Alec, the other 2 ships arrived, gliding to a stop before the first one. Elsa half expected an army of men to pour out of the ships, sending Alec and his men fleeing to the castle, but nothing of the sort happened. In fact, nothing happened at all. Everything was quiet and still as the 2 men completed their discussion. Then the man on the ship scooped up a bundle of rope and threw it over the side, where it landed on the dock. One of Alec's men looped it around a mooring, after which a gangplank was lowered and 3 men disembarked, walking single file down the ramp onto the dock. The leader was tall and dressed in a uniform, indicating he was a dignitary of some sort, but the other 2 were indistinguishable from the other sailors. Alec gestured toward them and pointed at the dock. Elsa wasn't sure what he was saying, but she could tell it wasn't received well. The plainly clothed men tightened rank around their leader and appeared defiant, and the nearest of Alec's men responded by gathering around their captain, hands on sword hilts. "What's going on?" Anna asked, her face hovering over Elsa's shoulder. "Hush!" Elsa said, nudging her back. After some additional protest, the men unstrapped their swords and handed them over. One of the guards collected them. Then Alec led them toward the castle, barking orders as he passed other guards. 2 fell into formation behind him, following them to the castle, and the other 4 went down to the ships, taking up positions along the dock, presumably to keep an eye out for any treachery. Alec led the party along the docks and up the ramp, and when they entered the town square, Elsa pushed herself from the window and hurried to the throne, sitting down. Anna, Kristoff, and Olaf stared after her. "Elsa," Anna whispered, as if the men far below could hear her. "What do we do?" "Stand behind the throne. Leave the negotiations to me. If things get dangerous, Marshmallow will protect us." Anna and Kristoff exchanged a nervous glance, then rushed to the throne with Olaf, taking up stations behind it. Olaf could sense the intensity of the situation and cowered behind Kristoff, forgetting his usual insistence on introducing visitors to the Queen. There was a long delay, and Elsa had time to wonder about the intentions of the Southern Isles. She found their lack of communication strange, if not foreboding. After sending Hans home as a prisoner, she expected an apology of some sort, or at least an acknowledgement of his crimes, if not a full denunciation. But she'd received nothing to indicate they felt any remorse over the trouble fomented in her kingdom. At one point, she considered sending a diplomat to re-establish ties, but then the drought started and politics became rather unimportant. She'd sent a request for assistance to them, as she had to every neighboring kingdom, hoping they'd take the opportunity to make amends, but they never responded. No offer of trade ever arrived, nor did she receive a letter explaining their refrain. So why had they come now? She'd considered the possibility of an unscrupulous kingdom coming to exploit Arendel's vulnerable state, taking advantage of its weakness to execute their own selfish agenda. If that was the Southern Isles' intention, then she was ill-prepared. Without an army, a sufficient number of guards, or a stock of weapons, their only defense lay in her magic, but she shuddered at the thought of lashing out with her powers, even if it was to protect her own people. Could she live with herself if she did harm with her magic? Could she live with herself if she didn't? The throne room was as silent as a crypt, and Elsa could hear the blood thumping in her ears. Then the faint echo of castle doors opening and closing, sounding distant though it wasn't far away. Another long silence was followed by the shuffle of marching feet on stairs, which continued down the hall and stopped outside the throne room. From the angle of her throne, she couldn't see into the hall, and she was left to wonder who was out there, but more importantly, why they'd come. Alec emerged alone, and Elsa studied him for a clue, some sign regarding the disposition of their visitors, but nothing betrayed his rigid expression. "Your Majesty," he said, "Prince John of the Southern Isles has come to seek an audience with the Queen of Arendelle." Elsa noticed Anna was as surprised as she was at the mention of a prince from the Southern Isles. Elsa wondered if Prince John would be any different from his treacherous brother. "Do you suspect any ill intent?" Elsa asked. "I cannot say with certainty, Your Majesty, but everything seems to be in order. They surrendered their weapons, and I'll be alerted if the men on the ships attempt to disembark." "Very well. Send him in, but don't lower your guard. I trust you'll remain on alert until I command otherwise." "Of course, Your Majesty," he said with a bow before disappearing into the hall. He exchanged some words with the men there, and she waited, literally on the edge of her seat. Alec came in first, followed by the men from the Southern Isles who were flanked by 2 guards, one on each side. When Elsa caught sight of the prince, she panicked. Somehow, beyond all possibility, it was Hans who entered the room. What was he doing here? How'd he make it past the guards? Why'd Alec let him in? She looked for the sword that must surely be at his waist, and the magic swelled within her, preparing to defend against an attack. But no one else was alarmed or on guard, and this confused her. She looked again, studying the man in more detail, and was glad to see it was a case of mistaken identity. She let out a sigh of relief. No, this man wasn't Hans, but it was obvious he was related. His face was characterized by the same distinguished features as his brother. Large, piercing eyes, a prominent chin, and a thick crop of auburn hair parted down the middle. He even dressed in a similar manner, wearing a white jacket decorated with medals and bearing golden tassels that bounced on his shoulders with each step. His legs, clad in plain gray trousers, plunged into black boots at the knees. Despite all the similarities, though, there were clear differences, the first being his trimmed sideburns. He also looked a little taller and older than his brother, had a large scar across his forehead above his right eye, and his jaw and chin were more squared than rounded. Studying these disparities settled her nerves, but she was still anxious over his unexpected visit. Perhaps he wasn't Hans, but was he any better? Alec raised his hand and the procession stopped halfway to the throne. The prince's attention was drawn to the giant snowman behind the throne, and Elsa saw a glimmer of surprise flash over him, but it was quickly suppressed, and she was unable to read anything else in his expression. Alec stepped aside, making a sweeping gesture with his hand. "Your Majesty, I present to you Prince John of the Southern Isles." "Your Majesty," the prince said, dropping down to one knee and bowing his head, his companions following suit in one coordinated motion. It was an appropriate display of honor, but Elsa wondered how genuine it was. She motioned for them to rise, and they did so, standing at attention while they waited for her to address them. "Prince John," Elsa said, trying to bury her unease beneath an air of authority, "your visit is quite unexpected. I apologize for not making you feel more welcome, but these are strange times, and we are not on the best terms with the people of the Southern Isles, as I'm sure you're well aware." Prince John bowed. "Your Majesty, I assure you no apology is necessary. I'm quite aware of the strain young Prince Hans put upon the relations between my kingdom and yours. His actions were reprehensible, and I'm ashamed to call him a brother. Please accept my apology, and I hope those events, tragic as they were, won't hinder a peaceful reception of myself and my men." "I appreciate your words, but you did not sail 3 ships across the vast reaches of the sea to apologize for the actions of one rogue dignitary." "You're quite correct, Your Majesty." "So then tell me, Prince John, why have you come to Arendelle?" Elsa studied him for any indication his next words would be less than truthful. However, she knew if he was anything like his brother, his skill in deception would exceed any scrutiny on her part. Alec seemed to be thinking the same thing, his hand not straying from the hilt of his sword. "My kingdom has heard of the suffering of Arendelle, but not until recently was I informed of the full extent of its tragedy. I've come to you with 3 ships laden with as much food, water, and other provisions that I could safely pack aboard. They are a gift to the people of Arendelle and their beautiful queen." Elsa wasn't prepared for this news. She'd been bracing for the worst, preparing for some kind of confrontation, and all her defenses were up. This left her in a physical state of anxiety, with her heart thumping in her ears and every muscle tensed. When her stress levels plummeted, replaced by a swell of relief and disbelief, it was like having a rug pulled out from under her, and she felt dizzy. She had trouble focusing on John as the room seemed to spin around her, and she ran over his words again, convinced she must have misheard or misunderstood. But no, she hadn't. There was a hush in the room as everyone waited for her response, but she didn't know what to say as she struggled to believe if it was really true. 3 ships full of food and water? 3 ships full? How was that possible? Over the past few weeks, the drought brought its full weight to bear upon her. It had become more apparent with each passing day they might not find a way out of this awful disaster. The fear closed in on her, tightened its grip, and when Kristoff and Anna brought news of another failed search, her last hope for salvation was snuffed out. For the first time, she felt they'd run out of options, that she'd failed, and with all hope gone, she succumbed to despair, crushed under the weight of her own failure. But with John's announcement, that weight was suddenly lifted, and she could breathe again. The relief was indescribable. Tears welled in her eyes. She pressed her fingers to her lips, waiting for the moment to pass, but it didn't. She covered her mouth with her hand, unable to speak while a lump the size of an apple rose in her throat. Anna must have understood her silence, for she stepped out from behind the throne and put a hand on Elsa's shoulder. "Arendelle is deeply grateful for this wonderful act of kindness," she said, doing her best to sound regal. Elsa was relieved to have the attention taken off her, and it was just what she needed to regain control. She looked at the man who stood before her, and she no longer saw Hans looking back at her, or a threat of any kind. She saw not a stranger, but a friend. "Thank you," Elsa said, but the words came out as a whisper. She cleared her throat and said again, "Thank you." "It is my great honor," John said with a bow. Elsa gave a nod to Alec, who then motioned to his men, and they retreated. John appeared to relax now that the threat of a sword was no longer at his back. "Allow me to introduce ourselves," Elsa said, standing to take Anna by the arm. "This is my sister, Anna, the Princess of Arendelle." Anna gave an excited wave, and John waved back, smiling. Elsa turned to Kristoff, who was still standing behind the throne, his head and shoulders visible above the spiky ridges of the backrest. "This is Kristoff, my sister's fiancé." Kristoff seemed caught off guard by the introduction, and he looked to Anna, as if unsure how to respond, but she gave him no direction. After a long pause, he settled on a respectful nod. "Hello," John replied, as if greeting an old friend. "And last but not least, this is Olaf," Elsa said, gesturing for Olaf to come forward. He was barely visible, peeking out from behind the throne, but sensing the change of atmosphere, he came bounding out into open view, his twig arms held open wide. "Hi, I'm Olaf, and I like warm hugs." "So the stories are true," John said, getting down on one knee to examine the snowman. It had been a long time since anyone looked at Olaf like that, Elsa thought, with the wonder and fascination of seeing such a creature for the first time. Most of the dignitaries who visited tried to hide their surprise at meeting a walking, talking snowman, or at least censored their reaction, but not John. "Spectacular!" he said, examining him for a few moments more before standing back up. He pointed at Marshmallow in the corner. "And that one there, is that one alive too?" Elsa nodded. Marshmallow was a fearsome sight, there was no doubt, but John's face bore no hint of fear, his mouth open in awe as he rubbed the back of his neck. "Just fantastic," he said. He seemed to be lost in thought, his gaze lingering upon Elsa without words, like he'd lost all track of time or place. Then he shook his head, as if snapping out of a daydream. "Oh, excuse me. Where are my manners?" He directed his attention to his two companions. "This is Eric and Lars, my most trusted advisors. I'm afraid you'll find them to be quite a bore to have around, though. Nothing like your fine companions, I'm sure." He gestured to the men. "Say hello, boys." They didn't respond. John frowned with mock disdain. "See what I mean?" "What happened to Hans?" Anna blurted out. John, his attempt at levity foiled, became serious, the whole room growing silent. Kristoff stood by Anna, grabbing her hand. "Anna, is it?" John asked. Anna nodded. John delivered his next words without emotion. "I'm sorry to report to you that Hans is dead." "What?" Elsa exclaimed, letting go of Anna's arm. "What happened?" Anna asked, and Elsa wondered if she felt as conflicted as she sounded. No one had been affected by Hans' treachery more than Anna, and Elsa wouldn't have been surprised if she'd heard relief or satisfaction in Anna's voice. But beneath a layer of morbid curiosity, Elsa detected concern. Not so much that it was obvious, but it was there. Elsa, for her part, was relieved to know that Hans would never again be a threat to any of them, but she found the news disturbing nonetheless. Kristoff appeared unruffled. John loosened his gloves one finger at a time and pulled them off, holding them in one hand and gripping his wrist with the other. "When Hans returned to the Southern Isles," he said, "he was tried as a traitor, charged with an act of war against an allied kingdom. Sentenced to 10 years hard labor, he was to be transferred to a penal colony on one of the islands in our realm. He never made it." "What?" Elsa said. "Why not?" "The ship transporting him ran into a storm, and it was lost. There were no survivors." "Oh my," Anna said, raising a hand to her mouth, and there was no doubt she found these details disturbing. Kristoff only raised an eyebrow. Elsa, though, wasn't sure how she felt about Hans' passing. On the one hand, Hans had committed horrible crimes, acts so despicable they deserved the harshest punishment. On the other hand, it brought her no joy to know he'd been killed in such a tragic manner. It made her think of her parents, how frightened they must have been when their ship was overwhelmed by the storm which would claim their lives. It was an all too familiar thought, one she'd contemplated many times to her dismay, and she didn't welcome it back now. Her and John had this in common. They'd both lost family to the dangers of the sea, and although he'd related the story in a factual manner, as if it were a stranger's tale and not a brother's, she imagined there must be more to it, and her heart went out to him. "Prince John," she began, but he interrupted her. "Please, just John." "All right, then. John, I'm sorry for your loss. Hans may have acted imprudently, but he was still your brother. Half-brother, actually. Perhaps he didn't deserve to die, but he put himself in that situation by disgracing our royal family. It's my hope this gift will in some small way restore a measure of honor to my family's name." Elsa made a small curtsy. "Your generosity is a testament to the good of you and your people. How can I possibly hold any malice after such an incredible act of kindness? Arendelle is truly in your debt." "Thank you, Your Majesty," he said with a bow. "You may call me Elsa," she said, the faintest of smiles upon her lips.